we're going to be doing a sort of fully integrated experience where we're going to be talking about storytelling the whole time. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of a roadmap for today, we're going to start by talking about why we tell stories. We're going to do a couple breakout groups today, one near the beginning and then one closer to the end. We are going to talk about narrating our own stories. We'll do a little writing exercise. So at some point you'll want to have something that you can write with, whether that is paper and pencil or pen or whatever writing utensil you love, or on your computer, but something that you can jot some ideas down with. And then we'll also be talking about using storytelling techniques in the classroom, especially in terms of assignments. I want to start just by saying thank you again for inviting me to be here with you today, and especially thank you to Laura, Tracy, and Kataka for all of their support leading up to today's workshop. I've worn many hats as an educator. I've been a tutor, a faculty member, an administrator, an advisor, but all of that really means that I'm a professional storyteller. I have an MFA in creative writing, and my craft is infused very heavily into nearly everything that I do, from training peer tutors to offering faculty development around writing, or even crafting messages and structures to help students navigate intentionally and easily access support during their undergraduate education. I've spent the last few weeks meeting with students who've recently been placed on academic probation, and storytelling is at the heart of all student support, but especially these meetings. The story of who the student is, the story of their academic life and experiences so far, the story of where they're going. And when I work with students who faced academic roadblocks, I tell them how much I love to fail. Failure is, after all, a story. I ask them to create a failure resume, which catalogs something that they might perceive as a failure. And their job on this failure resume is to retell the story of the failure in the context of their future success story. How can the story of our failures help us along our journey? To illustrate this, I tell them one of my own stories about how I nearly failed chemistry during my freshman year of college. Spoiler, instead of going to the huge impersonal chemistry lectures, I watched Bollywood movies with my roommate. She was good at chemistry. I suppose I thought it might rub off. I became a writer and she became a doctor. So I'll let that tell you how it turned out. My goal in telling this story is to be vulnerable and to showcase that a failure during the first semester of college isn't the end of the road. But I also want to model how the student can tell their own stories. Stories are powerful, and today we're going to look at how we can harness the power of storytelling in our practice as educators. We'll talk first about telling our own stories and then examine storytelling techniques that we can use in other ways in our classes. One of my favorite provocateurs is Toni Morrison. And one of the things that she said about storytelling is that what we know now isn't all that we're capable of knowing. And I think this is why telling stories is so important. We are our own stories, and also stories help us to build empathy and to build bridges and to do any number of things. Some of those things might be to motivate and inspire, to generate interest in a topic or spur curiosity. We might use stories to make content relevant or memorable for students, to give opportunities for analysis, practice listening, incorporate reflection. We might use stories to cultivate community or set a tone of story sharing in our classrooms or other educational spaces. We use storytelling to challenge listeners to see beyond dominant narratives and to help understand other perspectives. And of course, as you all know from the sessions that you've been attending here, stories, of course, as educators, help us develop our personal and professional identities. So before we dive into storytelling, I think it's important to see that that list can apply to nearly any discipline and to nearly any level of education. And so what I want us to do is to take just a moment to get into breakout groups and to talk about a time that an educator told a story that stuck with you. Why were they telling the story? And what about that sticks with you, whether it was a story you heard a long time ago or today? Are you a person who tells story in the classroom? And if so, when have you used it and why? And is there a topic, lesson, or a unit that might offer an opportunity for incorporating storytelling into your classroom? How would telling a story enhance that learning experience? Okay. Feel free to drop in the chat anything that you wanted to share from your group. I know in our group, we talked about all of the different purposes that stories can be used for, whether that's to help students focus or bring the content into focus, or to inspire people to action, or I think we also got a story in our group about how stories can really showcase something that motivates you because it's kind of scary in a sense. And then also that stories can be used just to give space between things. So there are a lot of ways that stories can be used in a classroom. And then there are ways that they can last, because the story that are told by some of our teachers often stick with us longer than the lessons that they actually impart in those moments. What I want to talk about first is, how do we tell those stories? Sometimes we are doing didactic storytelling where we are telling our students a story, whether it is our story, a personal story, or whether it is a story of a person or a place or a situation that has happened related to the content of our classes. So we're going to look at how we can think about planning these stories so that when we tell them, we can tell them with intention, and also just to sort of practice that brainstorming of the stories. Joan Didion is another one of my favorite writers, and the essay Why I Write wrote that short stories demand a certain awareness of one's own intentions, a certain narrowing of the focus. And I think it's really important when we think about storytelling that we make sure that we're using stories with intention. There are definitely opportunities in any classroom to tell casual stories or to tell stories off the cuff that are not planned, and those have space too. But bringing storytelling into your practice isn't simply about adding stories for the sake of storytelling. It's also about doing it with intention. And I like to think about this as knowing your aim, right? Who is your audience? What is your intent? And what is your message? Now, I am a writing instructor, so I like to think about this in terms of the rhetorical situation. What we need to plan when we're thinking about a story is the place where the writer or the speaker, as the case might be, the subject of the story or how it connects to your class, and the audience all converge. Essentially, what we're trying to think about is, why are we telling this story now? And what is it that we want to achieve by telling this story? How is it going to be presented in order to achieve that aim? I like to use backward design in my own practice as a teacher. And so when I think about whether it's the right moment to tell a story, I like to ask myself, what is my purpose for telling the story? Why the story? Why now? Who is my audience? And how will hearing the story impact my students? What's the context of the story? Is it that it will help my learning goals? And if so, how? And should the story be personal, or is it something that I want to tell about someone else? What is the topic? How does the story relate to the content of my lesson? So I am curious from you all to see, what do you think makes a good story? So if you all would write your answers in the chat, tell me, what are the things that you think of when you think of a good story? Relatability, that's a great one. A memorable punchline. Suspense. These are great. What would you say are the building blocks of those good stories? What makes something relatable in a story? Characters, perfect. Characters are the people involved. Awesome. So when we think about planning our story, not only is it important to know why we're going to tell a story and to think about how it connects to the work that we're doing in the classroom, but we also want to think in advance about some of the important building blocks of the story. So who is the main character or the protagonist? Again, some stories are personal and they're about ourselves, but sometimes you're telling the story about a master bridge builder. We might also be looking at the character's emotional arc. Of course, there are more than one character in a lot of stories, and those characters might be there for different purposes. When you are thinking about your story, it's important to think about why the other characters are appearing in your story. So are they at the service of the protagonist? And if so, why? And how can we describe them from the lens of the main character, whoever that is? We also want to think about the emotional arc of the story. And there are a number of different arcs that characters can go through. And in fact, different characters might be on different emotional arcs during the same story. But when we think about the emotional arc of a story, what we're really thinking about is how do we want the audience to feel at the end of this? If we want our audience to come away with that feeling of inspiration, what kind of an emotional arc do we want our story to have? Do we want it to end on a high note? Or are we telling a story where we want to indicate that it's a call to action? And we might want to show a sort of falling emotional arc, a riches to rags emotional arc, if you will. We want a story to have scene and vivid details. Some of the things that you all talked about in terms of suspense and challenge and conflict, sometimes that is about plot, which I'll talk about next, but often it's about the vivid details, because the more vivid that a story is, the more that your audience member can see concretely how the story works, then the more they're going to be hooked, whether it's that punchline or whether it's the suspense that built just through the details alone. It doesn't mean that your story has to be chock full of details, but really thinking about what kind of details are going to help build the scene. The plot of the story is important in that most stories have some kind of a structure. And typically we tend to follow a typical plot diagram, and I will show you that on the next slide. That is a very Western approach to story structure, and there are, of course, different cultural approaches and different structures. So the plot diagram that I'm going to show you is from that lens. But stories that are memorable often showcase tension or change. I avoided saying conflict here because conflict is an important component of a story, but it often sounds to some people like I'm talking about drama. And there's a big difference between conflict and tension and drama. When a story is told, it might be about something very small, and it could be very small but very powerful. So what we're looking for when we think about conflict is also the tension, or how the character might be experiencing change over the course of the story. And then, of course, the theme. Often the subject or the outcome, what the reader will take away with them, or the listener will take away with them, is an incredibly important building block. So most of the time we think of stories as having some fundamental components, and you probably remember this, if not from your own classrooms, from your own early education. This plot diagram is really divided into the beginning, the middle, and the end of a story. The beginning does not necessarily have to mean the beginning of time. It can be the beginning of the story, and your story may begin in the middle of things. How we think about the beginning, and what do the readers need to know in order to understand, or listeners need to know in order to understand the story. Establishing the conflict early on is important. And again, I tell my students a lot of the time that conflict could be as simple as a character is hungry and they need to find a sandwich. It doesn't have to be a conflict that is incredibly melodramatic. We talk about the rising action, the climax point, which is really the point of change in the story, and then the falling action, how that reflection is incorporated into it, what the takeaway is, and then the resolution of the story. So we're going to do a writing exercise. I know some of us are probably master storytellers and have thought a lot about our own stories as educators. So you may have something that's on the tip of your mind to write about, but some of us may not necessarily feel comfortable staring at a blank sheet of paper. I know that for many students, beginning to write can be the most anxiety inducing component of writing generally. And I think that's true for all of us, whether we're students or not. And so we're going to start by brainstorming. So if you would get your writing materials ready, we're going to start by taking a blank sheet of paper. And at the top of the paper, I'd like you to write one root word. This word could be a person, a place, a concept, emotion, or a theme. I told you a story about failure resumes earlier, so my word might have been failure. You do not have to choose a word that is incredibly meaningful, because this is, after all, a writing opportunity that's incredibly low stakes. So this is not the only story that you will ever tell. So even if you choose one word today, you can always try this exercise again and choose a different word. If you do not have a word on your mind, you could choose a word from this virtual word bag. You might choose a word like desire or transformation, beginning, ending, lessons learned, or inspiration. So I'm going to give you just about a minute to take a look at these words and come up with your own word. Okay, so by now you should have one word at the top of whatever you're writing on. And what I'd like you to do is to write down the first 5 memories, stories associated with your root word. This is a list that is for you and for you alone. So complete sentences and correct spelling are optional. Essentially, I want you to think about what are the first 5 things that you think of when you think about the word that's on the top of your paper. I'm going to give you another minute to do that. I'm sorry, 2 minutes to give you some time to write all 5 of those down. Zoom has alerted me that it's too quiet and it's just been about 2 minutes. So by now I hope you have a few memories to draw from. If you didn't make it to 5, that's okay. If you made it more than 5, even better. What I'd like you to do now is to take just about 35 seconds or so to choose one of those memories. Again, this is for this practice exercise, and you can always return to any of the others later. All right, I hope you've selected one. I am now going to ask you a series of questions, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to respond to each one. With each of these questions, you will have less time than you probably want to fully develop your idea. The goal of this exercise is to get information on the page quickly. It is not to draft a final draft of a story or of an idea. And of course, these stories, I think I used the word memories earlier, but you could be telling an anecdote about somebody that you wanted to bring into the classroom. The exercise that I'm going to be going through right now is inspired by an exercise by the writer and comic artist, Linda Berry. I really love this exercise. I use it in my classroom a lot. I've modified it for the time that we have here today. And the goal is to give the students something to leave the classroom with so that when they go home, they're starting from an idea rather than starting from this blank space. So I'm going to start. And as I said, I'm going to pause after each question and give you time to respond to this. And if you do not have enough time, of course, you can always take the time you need to finish it up. If it gets really fast and you all want me to slow down, just say stop in the chat and I will slow down a little bit. So the first question that I'd like you to write down is, who is the main character and protagonist in this story? In addition to giving them a name, if they have a name, you might also offer a few detailed descriptions of this character or person. Who else is in this story? And why are they there? If that is something you can answer quickly, you may also offer descriptions of these other characters. What is the central conflict or problem or tension of this story? What is the protagonist or the main character's attitude toward the problem? Sometimes I also answer, what is their mood? Because what their attitude is and their mood might be two different things. But what's the attitude toward the problem? Who changes during the story and how do they change? What should someone listening to the story understand at the end of it? In other words, what's the key takeaway? So this is the last of the questions in our brainstorming exercise. So find a stopping place. I'll give you just an extra 30 seconds or so to wrap up where you are. And then I'd be happy to invite anybody who who would like to share their experience of writing in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute, I'd be delighted to hear what you all thought about the writing experience. When I do this exercise with students, I use a much longer series of questions, and those series of questions include several questions that focus on the details of the situation. I call it a 360-degree approach because I want them to be able to look around the scene of the story and to be able to take notes on all of it. The goal of the story is to get the foundational detail, the goal of this exercise is to get the foundational details down And I want also for the students to not only have the details, but the basic components they need to think about how they might plot this out. I keep using the word students because I am often teaching students, but also any storyteller can use this exercise to help them craft an idea really quickly. I do then go into revision. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some revision tips, because when you have an idea that you're working on, it's important to be able to go back in and think about how you want to develop that idea. So with a short exercise like this, when you go back to revise and you're able to be more intentional about the words that you choose, it's helpful to know that first words matter. I think one of you said in the chat earlier that that punchline is really important. And sometimes that punchline is the first line, and sometimes it comes later in the story. Sometimes there are multiple punchlines, but the words that we choose and how we start matter. It doesn't mean you have to start with the first line, but as you go back through and revise, really thinking about how you want to get into the story. Sometimes starting in the middle of things can make those first words easier. By starting in the middle of a story instead of at its very beginning, you start with a much more active situation. As I said earlier, stories need change and they need movement, and that is what will help keep your listeners engaged. And it's also what will help them understand why you are telling the story in the first place. When you are writing, it's important to use specific and vivid details. I'm going to just skip down one to using strong nouns and verbs, and then I'll go back up to the characters. Strong nouns and verbs are really important because of the way that our brains work. So when our brains process a noun, they process the noun the same way that they process encountering that noun. So when I say table, your brain lights up in the same place that it would if you were actually looking at a table. And the same is true for verbs. So when I say jump, the part of your brain that hears jump is also experiencing it the same way if you were actually jumping. It unfortunately doesn't translate to exercise for our brains, but using those strong nouns and those strong verbs to help craft your specific vivid details is important, because that is what will keep your listeners' brains activated while they're listening to you. Describe other characters in relationship to the protagonist. It's really important to not put people in the story just to have other people in the story or to be able to provide more of a scene. They really need to be there because they matter, and they need to be there because they matter to the character that's doing the changing. And silence is powerful. That is true both in the actual writing process, but it's also true that when we're writing and when we're speaking and we're telling our stories, we want to think about the places where we might want to pause and where we might want to allow the listener to react. I have included I've sent it to Kitaka, the extended brainstorming exercise, which he will share with all of you, and it has some of the detail-oriented questions as well. We're going to turn now to the second part of this, and sometimes we are telling a story. And it might be in a professional development setting, it might be in a classroom, it might be for any number of purposes. But often in the classroom, we can incorporate storytelling techniques in other ways. And so sometimes we're the guide helping other people tell stories. Some sort of to start off, I want to talk about some ideas for incorporating storytelling across the disciplines. When we incorporate storytelling into the class, we could be asking our students to tell their own story. This could be casual, it could be through writing, it could be an exercise that is specifically about storytelling. But storytelling doesn't have to be always about stories in their traditional sense. you can use storytelling to help present ideas and to help discuss the content of your class. So many of us might be used to seeing case studies in classes, and this is important because it is a practice of using storytelling as an educational technique. You could design a lecture as story. This is something that historians often do, to make sure that the entire lecture is designed around certain narrative components. You can use storyboarding as an activity in your classroom. It could be a pre-writing activity if you are in a classroom that's using writing, but storyboarding is also a good way to help understand other situations. And so that could be used as a means of analysis. It could be something that you do before you're designing an experiment. It could be a component of any number of things. So storyboarding our ideas and our thinking. Role playing is another technique for using storytelling in the classroom. Writing a story as a group and then allowing the students to write their own endings. Storytelling cubes, prompts, word lists, spinners, again, depending on what kind of an activity you've designed. I like to use photo voice in my classroom a lot, and photo voice is a technique that's related to participatory action research. And the idea is that students or anybody who's participating in this would take photos of things that they are focused on in their research or in the pursuit of whatever they're questioning or curious about, and use those photos to help them probe and present ideas. This is often useful for students who have a difficult time expressing themselves and writing the first time around. So giving them a different way of communicating an idea and then asking them to help explain why they've selected the photo that they have and what that photo showcases in relationship to the ideas that they're pursuing. And then, as you all have already talked about in this lecture series, multimedia storytelling projects like digital storytelling, virtual maps, timelines, and podcasts. And there are all kinds of wonderful tools out there for these. One of them I like to use is the Knight Labs tools, and they have a lot of great maps and timelines. And I'll often ask the students to do collaborative presentations using a mapping software so that they can put the ideas and the stories also to places and allow them to journey around the screen at the same time. An example of how I've done this in my own class, I had an advanced composition class. And of course, my examples are from the discipline of writing and composition and sometimes literature, but these are often transferable to other disciplines. The advanced composition course that I was teaching was primarily pre-service teachers. And the context is that I was teaching them about collaborative writing pedagogy and strategies for incorporating collaborative writing in their classroom. So the assignment that we did was based on the Humans of New York project. And I wanted them to do this as a group. It was a very small class, so I think there were about 7 people in the group. And I gave them this scenario that they'd been approached to create this Humans of New York style profile of our university. And I asked them to use photos and quotes and interview people on campus to be able to sort of capture the spirit of the place. Together, they created a proposal, and then they compiled their interviews and photos in whatever way they felt was most meaningful. And this was a really great exercise because we were able to use different collaborative writing pedagogy strategies to be able to understand how they could collaborate more effectively and how they could make their writing project more successful. So they planned this out from beginning to end, and they did everything from approaching our marketing department to make sure they were asking the right questions, to deciding what kind of people on campus they wanted to get involved in this, and then also what medium they would be using to present it. I didn't ask them to do it digitally. I told them they were more than welcome to do it offline, but they did decide to do it online, and that also meant that they had to go through the process of getting people's permission to publish their work and their interviews. What the students ended up creating was an entire Instagram profile, and they interviewed, I think, probably 10 or 15 people. And for each of them, they decided that they wanted to do not only a photo and a quote from their interview, but they also wanted to do an accompanying website so that they could actually provide the extended interviews because they liked them so much. So they did this, and then they also did a website that involved access to, again, the longer interviews. This was a really fun project, and it turned out even better than I could have possibly expected. And so there are all kinds of ways that you can do storytelling in terms of the content that you're trying to deliver in innovative ways. What I'd like to do now is we're going to go back out into breakout groups. And for this activity, I've prepared a Google Slides presentation, and there is one slide for each group. And the slides correspond with the groups that you see on the screen now. So group 1, if you're interested in digital storytelling in STEM, will be facilitated by Laura, but you'll also be using the first slide in the Google Slides document. Kataka, would you mind dropping the link to that so we have it in advance? And I'm sorry we didn't do that earlier. Each of the breakout groups is going to watch a really brief video, and then I have provided on this slides presentation a few discussion questions, although you're welcome to respond in any way that you would like to the examples that are presented. You will be able to choose which group you'd like to go to based on the topic that's described here. And then each of you will watch a video. It's about 2 to 3 minutes, and then you'll be able to discuss it. And then we'll close the groups after about 10 minutes and come back together to talk a little bit about this. Are we all back from the breakout groups? Yeah, it looks like it.
I think everyone's back now, yes.
All right, awesome. Well, I hope you enjoyed that activity. And I just want to sort of bring it back to backward design one last time in the context of that activity. When we plan our own stories, we really want to be intentional about why we're doing it. But when we use storytelling in the classroom or in an assignment, it's also important to plot out really the why are we including this activity. I hope that it's clear that storytelling can be really useful in all kinds of disciplines and in all kinds of big and small ways, but that we want to know why will a story enhance a particular lesson before we choose to do it. And it's also important to think about who will be the storyteller. Tracy and I were just talking about some of the things they discussed in her group, and the question of if the instructor, the faculty member thinks that it's maybe not something they're capable of doing in terms of producing like a narrative story about whatever content, like in this case, it was a math story. You could flip it to the students and have the students tell the story, but it's important to think about when you're designing these activities, who is actually going to be the person telling the story or the people telling the story? What purpose does it serve, the lesson or the assignment? What objectives will the storytelling relate to? And what do you want your students to understand and take away from the learning experience? Is it that you just want something for them to keep in their mind, to make it more memorable, to understand the content? Do you want them to leave from that experience wanting to become a scientist? How do you want them to feel at the end of the experience? And that's important to think about first. Of course, the context of your course, the context of the students themselves, and the content. We want to think about the content of a lesson as well. How does the story or the activity work in that way? Lastly, what kind of storytelling techniques will be incorporated into the lesson? And oops, excuse me. So sorry. What will the students be producing work that integrates story, and what do they need to know about storytelling? So you may have to do some work around the components of stories in order to help them with the assignment itself. So it's not enough to say, I'd like you to produce a math narrative. You have to talk about some of the fundamental building blocks of a story in order for them to understand what they might do with that story or how they might turn a math concept into a story. What do they need to know about the content? Because if you're having storytelling as an exercise, but you also want them to come out of it with content, you want to make sure that the content is incorporated into the actual storytelling experience. And then to think about things like technology. Will students need training or practice on the technology? If you are trying to create a math cartoon, are you able to do it? Do you need a specific software? What help do you need? What help might the students need? And that can be part of the learning experience, but I think it's important to understand the requirements of it so that you also understand the scope of the assignment or what you're asking the students to do and how you want them to collaborate. Because it can add time and other additional skills that can be very rewarding, but it's also important to think about before you actually embark on that journey. And then I'm just wanting to leave you all with this quote from Margaret Atwood. You're never going to kill storytelling because it's built into the human plan. We come with it. So stories matter, and they will matter for all of us in all sorts of ways. No matter what your discipline or area or level of teaching or education is. With that, I'll just say thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat for a few minutes. And otherwise, I really appreciate this opportunity to spend this time with you talking about storytelling.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I'm actually really excited because I'm teaching backward design this coming week. And so I now have a whole activity to use with my students. So
great.
Yay.
I also found the story writing thing helpful because I decided to write on something that, the current world that we're all in right now, trying to figure out what teaching is going to be like this fall. And so I use my story of another time I was in a stressful, unknown situation, and it helped. It just was a good, reflective tool for me to process how I might deal with the current situation.
It's a thing I didn't put on any of my lists, but what I tell students often is that understanding stories can help us heal, they can help us celebrate, they can help us reflect and understand. There are all kinds of metacognitive bonuses to storytelling. So yeah.
Are there any other final comments or questions for Erin before we part ways?
Erin, in our group on photo voicing, the question came up about, how do educators and students, how do we deal with the technological divide, where there are people who are not so tech savvy, but the photo booths and so photo voice and so on is very cool, and it gets the kids excited and so on. Like, what advice you have for educators to help them integrate things like that in the classroom?
Yeah, I think that it's really important, especially because we all are in different educational contexts. And I think COVID-19 has shown us at the very least that not everybody has equal access to all kinds of tools. And that's true at many different educational levels. And also, sometimes when we talk about these digital tools, thinking about the other components about things like, what privacy am I asking my students to give up by participating in these tools, which is something that I've only recently sort of been presented with as a problem. So I think beyond the technical savvy component of it, there are a lot of reasons why you might want to think about what would this look like in an offline environment, right? I mean, it's been a very long time since I've used a point and shoot camera or a disposable camera, but and I am not a particular artist, but I've used photo voice techniques and had students actually draw their ideas. I've also had them make collages so that you can use the same idea of taking a picture of something that represents a problem in your community, but having them cultivate it with lower tech tools, right? So that they're not necessarily having to use a computer to develop their own digital story or something like that. I think also, and depending on where we are, some of your teaching and learning centers may have instructional designers that can help with that, or there may be people on your campuses that can help you brainstorm how to bring this technology into your classrooms. But I think that by starting with like what you want to achieve and thinking about what possible problems you might encounter in that in advance will just give you an opportunity to think about, you know, I always say to people, I love technology, I love teaching with technology, but I want it to be used intentionally. It's not technology for the sake of technology. It's because technology extends something that we're doing, right? And I think the same is true with things like photo voice, but people have been using photography for a really long time in lots of ways that didn't have to be on cameras. I assume you can still get photos developed somewhere.
Well, thank you. For those of you who are interested in learning more about this, Kitaka has created a guide on leveraging storytelling in your classroom. So he'll send that out in a follow-up email to everybody who is registered for this event or any of our past events. So you'll have lots of resources available at your fingertips for trying some things out and getting some more ideas around this. Is there anything else that anybody would like to say? Well, thank you again, Erin.